Landscape photography is one of the most exciting forms of photography, with thousands of different ways to photograph landscapes and so many thousands of photographers out there chasing the light in nature. Matt from B&H here, and in this video we're going to cover everything in a full guide on shooting landscape photography, and where better to do it than in the rugged landscapes of Iceland. Everything from research and planning, gear and accessories, and then we'll get out there in the field and talk about composition, settings, and so much more. So join us. All right, so much goes into research and planning for landscape photography. How do you pick what location to choose, and how do you know where you should actually go once you get to that location? This all comes in the planning stage, which we've done a ton of planning and picked Iceland because of how many rugged and beautiful landscapes there are in this country alone. And one of the many benefits of Iceland is just how much variety it offers, from landscape photography and astrophotography and aurora photography, which we'll also cover in this entire video series. And one of the other benefits of shooting in Iceland is just how accessible everything is, which means that even if we're not here for a very long time, we can walk away with as many good photos as possible. So once you have all of your locations picked on site, and maybe you did a little Instagram research, did hashtags or a Google search and looked at all the articles on your location, and you're actually here, well, first you want to make sure that you do some scouting. So that's why we're here when the light is not that fantastic right now, because we could see our composition at the very least, see where the sun is going to be by using the PhotoPills app, and then we could also maybe pick our lens choices, and then we'll be perfectly ready when the sun actually gets in a nice spot to provide some good lighting for our entire scene. And that way we just show up and we put our camera down and we're ready to take a good photo. All right, with all that said, I think it's time for some coffee because I'm still very much running on New York time. So let's head inside into the warmth where we'll talk about gear and accessories so you can get the perfect shot. Well, we couldn't find anywhere warm, so I just threw on an extra base layer, some hand warmers. I'm gonna power through because we have to talk about gear, one of my favorite topics. First things first, the cameras. I'm using a Sony a7R5, which is my primary camera, and as a backup, I'm using the Sony a7CR. Both have very similar specs, 60 megapixels, 4K video, and also the a7R5 actually is capable of 8K video, which is pretty impressive. Other than that, they have similar features like focus stacking, HDR shooting, interval shooting. I love also setting up the a7CR on the side when I'm maybe shooting something and I'll take a quick time lapse. It's really easy to do, and it helps me have a video at the end of the day as well. Moving on to the lenses, I have a series of Sigma lenses here, and I want to cover all of my focal lengths, so I'm carrying a mix of both primes and zooms. Primes particularly for areas where I need the extra low light and I want those extra stops, but zooms where I really want the reach and versatility of carrying maybe less. You don't necessarily need all of these for landscape photography, but if you want to cover all of those focal ranges, this might be your best bet. So starting off with some of the art lenses, and then I also have two sport lenses that I'll talk about a little bit later on. The 20mm is perfect for landscape photography because you're not too wide and you're not too close, so I find it to be a good range to be in. And of course, if you're indecisive like me sometimes, then I'll opt for the 14 to 24mm so I can cover all of that ground. A really sharp lens, great for landscapes. Interestingly enough, I've been using the 14 to 24 a lot this week, again because of that versatility and my indecisiveness. I just like getting a lot of the landscapes in frame. I know you can also opt for closer zooms, and we'll get into that later, which sometimes I will for that compression. But landscapes, I love capturing the vastness sometimes, so going for the 14 to 24 really covers all of that range. In addition to that, the 14mm prime f1.4 DGDN art lens, that is super fast for this focal length. This is great for astrophotography, which we'll also cover in this series, but it's perfect for landscapes as well. Sometimes I will put an ND filter behind that for some smooth waterfall shots. Overall, love this lens and that ultra wide It also has, on the bottom, one of my favorite things about some of these newer lenses from Sigma, they have these built-in ND and other filters that you can put rear filters in here, and I don't have to lose my filters anymore. This is great. And then to bridge the gap between many of these focal lengths, I have the Sigma 24-70. I haven't used it a ton this week, but it's still really great for landscape photography if you don't want to go ultra wide, but you don't want to go too far in. The Sigma 24-70 is the perfect in between. And then moving on to two of my favorite telephoto zoom lenses, both sport lenses, but still really fantastic for any kind of landscape photography because of that compression that it adds to your photos. And you can't go wrong with the versatility of the 60-600. That focal length is just mind-boggling. I remember when this lens came out about a year ago and I did a video on it, and I was so astonished with, yes, the focal range, but also just how sharp it is. So I've been carrying it around quite a lot this week. And the same goes for the recently announced 70-200 that came out this year. So sharp at f2.8, it also is really fast. So maybe I can't get quite the shot because it's darker out and I can't get it with a 60-600, then I'll move to the 70-200, and it always tends to get the job done. When it comes to transporting my gear, I have two ways that I typically do that, and for the most part, I'm using my Shimoda Action X50 backpack. I love this backpack. If you know me in real life, then you know that I talk about it day and night, probably a little too much, but it's a 50-liter backpack. I could fit so much in here, especially with the roll top, and you could also tether a bunch of things on here, add tripods, water bottles, just a ton of features, and you could also upgrade the inner cube in case you have bigger lenses, or if you have smaller lenses, you can adapt your entire setup to that as well. And then also, if I'm flying, I love taking this Pelican 1510 case because it's a carry-on friendly case, and it's much more rugged for flying, and sometimes if I don't want to carry it on my back, this also has roller wheels. Anytime I can get weight off my back, I would much prefer that. All right, moving on to some of the accessories. And you know, I was about to say the tripod is the most important, and it probably is, but it's also freezing here, so I'm just gonna start with hot hands. If you're going somewhere cold, bring some hand warmers. They may save your life, as they're doing for me in this very video, because I have them on my gloves. But most importantly for landscape photography, a nice sturdy tripod. I'm using a Gitzo tripod. I love these tripods because, I don't know if you could see right now, but it is really, really windy. And having a sturdy tripod is crucial because if you're shooting long exposures, you don't want to introduce any shake into your photos. So make sure that you have a nice sturdy tripod. I use Arca Swiss plates because I have maybe Peak Design plates, and I want to make sure that everything is compatible with each other, so I prefer Arca Swiss type heads. In that same line of thinking, I also have the Peak Design dual lens holder that I also sometimes place on my Peak Design clip on my backpack. You can put two lenses on here. Again, indecisive, can't decide which lens to bring. I'll bring them all and I'll put them on here, and I love having it right on my chest often. Moving on from there, let's talk about some filters. One of the most important parts about landscape photography, and for that to house most of my filters, I have the Shimoda filter wrap. Of course it's Shimoda, and of course it's green, because I love this thing so much. And I like to show all my coworkers it, all my friends it. My mom doesn't care that much about it, but I'll show her anyways. And I also have it labeled because I'm the most organized on this team. Don't tell anybody I said that. I have a CPL filter from Polar Pro. It also has 4 stops of ND. I almost always use this filter. And I also have just the CPL filter alone for that. And I also have 2 Cineblooms, primarily use that for video. And then I have a ton of step-up rings, and the crew here keeps trying to steal them, but I'm not going to let them. Below that, I have some miscellaneous accessories, whether it be Allen keys, adapters for USB. I have memory cards in here as well. I just like to have everything in one place that I know I could always go back to. In addition to that, I have rear ND filters. These filters are interesting because they actually go behind the lens, and because of that, you won't get dust on your lens, on your filters all the time, which I think is fantastic. And like I was saying before, the lens caps, some of those Sigma lens caps can actually house these filters, so you always have them on you. All right, we've been making up somewhat of a jingle for this, but if you want to tether your tools, do so with tether tools. This is a power bank, and I also have the on-site relay system that I can hook up a dummy battery into my camera to basically be running for hours and hours, especially good if you have a time lapse going. But this is good if you want to charge your phone, you want to charge your camera, anything like that, and this mounts literally right onto the tripod. So I love having this as a backup power bank, and it is perfect, especially when your camera battery is dying a bit faster in cold weather like this. Moving on from there, a headlamp is so important. Landscape photographers, if you're shooting sunrises or sunsets, what comes before sunrise? It's dark out. After sunset, it's dark out. And yes, you can do astrophotography after that, but you're going to want a good headlamp to make sure that you're safely navigating your landscape area and you actually know where you're going. You're not rolling an ankle on some rock, which, we walked 45 minutes to this plane wreck yesterday, and having a headlamp was crucial because I don't know what we would have done without it. So in addition to all of that, I also have I'm using it right now, a Z-seat. Maria Perez on the B&H social team gave this to me, really nice of her. Autumn Schrock gave her the idea. If you're out shooting landscapes, I was sitting on some really hard rocks yesterday, and now my knees are kind of hating me for it. So carry a Z-seat with you all the time and your knees will thank you. All right, last but not least, if you're thinking in this video, Matt, you look like a stuffed sausage with all those layers on, you would be right, because I'm wearing so many layers right now, which is important if one, you're shooting in Iceland, but if you're shooting in any cold weather, carry a lot of merino wool base layers for your top to bottom and also your socks. Really, really thick, heavyweight socks will get you through, and just layer up, carry down mid layers if you want, or you could also opt for fleece and maybe a parka, carry gloves. And again, one more shout out to hand warmers. Last but not least, some camping meals, because everything around here in Iceland is closed after like 9 p.m. and I still gotta eat when I'm shooting landscapes, so I bring along camping meals, and you should too. Maybe a stove to actually cook them, and also stay hydrated out there. It's very important in cold weather especially. Anyways, now that we've covered all of the gear, camera gear, and accessories that you need, and most importantly, the food, I think it's time we head out and shoot some landscape photography. What music should we play? Some Icelandic folk to really speak to the soul here?
Sure. Well, sorry everybody.
All right, so you heard all about the gear that we're taking out to shoot landscapes, and we're now prepared and we're here in nature. So let's talk a little bit about composition. There are a few tools when it comes to framing in particular for your compositions that you should keep in mind when you're out there shooting, and then you could explore and experiment a little bit from there. The Fibonacci spiral is a sequence often found in nature, and because of that, the human mind finds it pleasing to the eye. So of course, something like that you'd want to include in your photographs. There are multiple ways to do this if you have the overlay built into your camera to turn on the spiral or the golden ratio, or you can also reframe things in post-processing in apps like Adobe. One major aspect of framing your landscape photography is going to be whether you want to shoot vertical or you want to shoot landscape, and it largely depends on the scene that you're trying to photograph and what it lends itself to. Like Selja landfalls in the background here definitely calls for a more vertical landscape. However, it really depends on what your output is going to be. Maybe you're shooting for just social media and Instagram, which is important these days, and a 4x5 is something that you want to frame for. Or maybe you want to frame for print or a magazine where you want to leave space for any kind of text or something like that. All this is something you want to keep in mind as you're framing. Sometimes you can get away with trying to frame for multiple platforms, but I've found that shooting multiple photos for different platforms tends to be the best. All right, one of my favorite parts about shooting on Sigma lenses, especially these ones with the collars here, is all I have to do to change between landscape and portrait and back and forth is a simple twist of the collar, and I'm ready to frame for pretty much everything. One of the many reasons that these lenses are so great, especially the Sigma 14mm. Adding depth to your landscape photography is going to be one of the most important parts as well. So having a clear foreground, middle ground, and of course your background helps to tell the overall story. So for example, in a scene like this, where there's ice in the foreground, it helps tell the story of, where are we? Iceland, of course it helps. Or maybe you're on black sand beach. What tells the story better than having a little bit of black sand, having your camera nice and low, and having, of course, the black sand in the foreground. Maybe you're on Diamond Beach where there's massive pieces of ice everywhere. well, that's perfect for your foreground element as well. And pro tip, using an ultra wide angle lens for this, where you can get really close to your foreground element, makes it all the much better, and I'm going to be doing that with the Sigma 14mm prime. All of these pieces help to tell the full story of your landscape photos. HDR shooting is going to be one of your best friends when shooting highly dynamic scenes out in nature. So basically what you're going to want to do is, if your camera doesn't have the HDR function where it automatically brackets maybe one stop for 3 images, then you could just do this manually by lowering your exposure one stop and raising it one stop above proper exposure. And then you would take those 3 exposures and merge them in post-processing for a highly dynamic result. Now, these cameras are getting so good nowadays with so many stops of dynamic range that it's becoming less and less needed. However, it's always good to have that option there. Pixel shifting is a way to merge a bunch of different photos into one massive file. On Sony cameras, it's called pixel shifting, but other camera brands call it something else. And then on the Sony a7R5, which is normally 60 megapixels, 16 images merged together is 240 megapixels, which is going to be a massive file, so I hope your computer will handle it. And you don't really need it all the time, so use it sparingly and only when the scene calls for it. And the limitation of it is also that you can only really do so when the scene is completely still. We've all heard about panoramas. I still love incorporating them into landscapes because they're just an easy way to capture the entire scene around you. Now, you could go and get maybe a panorama head, which would help you to perfectly align all of your panoramas, but it's pretty easy to just do so handheld and scan your entire scene, making sure that you're leaving enough overlap for your processing software to properly merge them together. If you're having difficulty getting your entire landscape scene in focus, or maybe you have a really complex shot where your foreground element is really close to the camera and your background is really distant, then focus stacking is a perfect technique to help fix this. What you want to do is focus on different elements in your scene and merge these photos in post-processing. Now, multiple camera brands like the Sony a7R5 has this built into it, so you just do a focus bracketing and it'll shift the focus on each different field in your frame, and then you merge that together and you have a really deep focus scene. I'm really low to the ground right now trying to do a focus bracket with the a7R5, which actually does it for you and shifts the focus, because to get our foreground and such a far background in focus, we're gonna have to take multiple photos and then stack them in post-processing. I'm on the Sigma 70-200 because I can get so much compression in this shot, and right now it looks fantastic with a foreground that we're really far away from the lighthouse, and we have the snow on the ground, a little bit of the rocks also in the foreground, and we're using focus stacking in order to stack all of these photos. In fact, with the Sony a7R5, it'll actually focus stack for you, basically shifting the focus from each field until you get the entire image in focus. When it comes to settings for landscape photography, you'll find that I'll often shoot at around f8 to f11 for aperture. And that's because I really want to get the entire scene in focus. And when it comes to ISO, I try to keep that as low as possible, but with such capable cameras nowadays, I don't mind cranking that up when necessary. For shutter speed, this varies based on the scene. If I'm photographing a waterfall or any kind of water feature, sometimes I like to smooth out that water by shooting a long exposure. A half a second or longer tends to do the job, but I like to experiment with anything longer than that. And if I want to incorporate that moving water in the photo, then I might want to shoot with a faster shutter speed. Also with clouds, if I want to shoot a long exposure of clouds, this helps to smooth out all the clouds. It's a really interesting effect, and you definitely might want to experiment with it. Now, to accomplish much of that, you're going to need an ND filter, which I mentioned earlier in the gear section of this video, in order to slow down that shutter speed, because it's pretty bright out right now. And so the ND filter will help me stop down the camera and expose properly for a longer exposure. Another filter to include here is a polarizer or circular polarizer. This helps to remove any unwanted reflections in your landscapes, especially when you're photographing water features. It'll help to just smooth it all out and remove those reflections. And it brings out the vividness of the skies, which will help your landscapes overall. One of the most interesting parts about coming to Iceland, immediately when you get here, you'll notice these mini churches all over the country in the middle of nowhere, much like this one right behind me that has a nice red roof. And behind it is Snæfellsnesjökull. I think I pronounced it right, probably not, but it's just a beautiful glacier in the background, and I have to photograph this, especially because there's this incredible road leading up to it, and this is the perfect opportunity to include a leading line into our composition. Leading lines help to direct the viewer's attention on where to look in your photograph, and having a road is the perfect opportunity for that. I also have the Sigma 60 to 600 DG/DN sports lens, and I'm gonna also experiment with some compression in this shot, so I'll start about maybe 100 yards behind the church, and then I'll move back down the road to see how the compression affects our image. All right, to compensate for the somewhat harsh light, but still really beautiful on the church, I have my aperture at around f8, really the sharpest point of this lens, and my shutter speed around 250 of a second, and the ISO around 80. Let me know in the comments below which image is your favorite and which focal length is your favorite. The further back I go, the more of the mountains and Snæfellsnesjökull I get in the background. I'm gonna keep trying to pronounce it until I get it right.
Alright, 500 likes on this video and I'll drink some glacial water. I hear it's better than the New York water, but I don't know.
All right, thumbnail. Country roads, take me home to Iceland.